Imagine a country that is just sprinting up the global economic charts,
Right.
like actively closing the gap with the developed world. But, and here's the crazy part, nearly half of its poverty is caused simply because its people literally cannot get into a classroom.
Right. Yeah. It's a completely fractured reality.
Exactly. And it's a country where women participate in the labor force at a rate that honestly puts the West to shame, but they are simultaneously, just locked out of the financial rewards of their own hard work.
Yeah. They're doing the heavy lifting without the payout.
Right. And perhaps the most baffling thing of all, it's a country that is basically accidentally beating the world's wealthiest nations at, like green energy and planetary sustainability.
Right.
But at the exact same time, they are staring down the barrel of this explosive 27-fold increase in carbon emissions.
I mean, it is a statistical landscape that is just full of profound contradictions because when you look at the raw data, the traditional models we use to measure a nation's success, they just begin to buckle under the weight of these paradoxes.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a country that basically breaks the conventional rules of macroeconomic development in real time. We're talking about Laos.
Yep, Laos.
And the reason we are zeroing in on this specific nation today is because of this truly fascinating anomaly buried in a recent academic presentation. It's from the Data Analysis Expert Group dated March 2nd, 2026. And the report is called Laos Human Development Report, Seeking Green Leapfrogging in Imbalance.
Which is quite a mouthful, but the anomaly you're talking about it's the difference between their standard development rankings and their planetary adjusted rankings?
Yes, exactly. Because according to the globally accepted metrics, the Standard Human Development Index that literally every economist relies on, Laos currently ranks 155th in the world.
Yeah.
So it's a developing nation facing some pretty severe structural hurdles. But, and this is where it gets wild, when researchers apply a secondary filter, when they factor in the environmental cost of prosperity.
Meaning how much damage a country actually does to the earth to achieve its lifestyle.
Right, exactly. When you factor that in, Laos actually jumps up 3 spots in the global rankings to 152nd.
Which runs completely counter to the historical norm, by the way. Typically, when you apply an environmental penalty to a nation's development score, their rank just drops. I mean, the industrialized world is heavily penalized for its carbon-intensive prosperity.
Oh, you're sure.
The United States, Western Europe, parts of East Asia, they absolutely plummet when you factor in planetary pressures. But Laos moves up.
So the core mystery we need to unravel for you today is this: is Laos demonstrating a genuine green miracle? Like, have they engineered some brilliant blueprint for sustainable 21st century development that the rest of the world is just entirely ignoring? Or is this so-called green advantage just a statistical illusion, like a temporary byproduct of delayed industrialization, right? Are they actually sustainable, or are they just waiting for their turn to pollute?
Right. And to answer that, we really have to sift through a pretty dense ecosystem of data because the report relies on this complex web of indices. We've got the HDI, the GDI, the GII, the IHDI, the PHDI, and the MPI.
It's an alphabet soup.
It really is an alphabet soup. So our objective today is to strip away all that academic jargon and translate these metrics into the actual lived reality of the people on the ground. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, indices are just mathematical representations of human struggle and human potential.
Yeah. And if you are listening to this right now from, say, London or New York or Tokyo, you might be wondering why you should even invest your time analyzing the macroeconomic friction points of a Southeast Asian nation.
Fair question.
And the answer is that Laos serves as the ultimate microcosm for basically the defining challenge of our era. Because we live in a global system that is completely obsessed with infinite growth, but we are on a planet with finite resources. So watching a developing nation navigate the exact intersection of human prosperity, systemic inequality, and environmental limitation, it provides a mirror for the entire global economy. It really forces us to ask what the true cost of modern life actually is.
It forces us to question the very definition of progress. Does progress even count if it leaves half the population behind? Does it count if it requires the total degradation of the biosphere?
Right. So let's establish our baseline here.
Yeah.
To understand the paradox, we first have to understand the foundation. We are starting with the Standard Human Development Index, the HDI.
The big one.
Yeah, the big one. This is the bedrock metric the United Nations has used for decades to basically measure a country's overall achievement in its social and economic dimensions. So where did Laos start this journey, and where do they stand in this 2026 report?
Well, the researchers draw their historical baseline at the year 1990, and at that time, Laos possessed an HDI of just 0.409, which placed them firmly in the lower tiers of global development. But if you fast forward to the 2023 data utilized in the report, that number has climbed to 0.617.
Wow. Okay, so a jump from roughly zero point 0.41 to 0.62. That is, what, a 51% increase over roughly 3 decades?
Yeah, it's a remarkable trajectory. I mean, for context, the global average HDI grew from 0.608 in 1990 to 0.756 in 2023. So mathematically speaking, the growth slope for Laos is actually significantly steeper than the global average.
They're moving fast.
They're sprinting.
They
They are actively closing that absolute gap between themselves and the rest of the world.
I do notice, though, a slight irregularity in the trend line. Like looking at the dual axis chart in the presentation, there's a pretty distinct dip in 2021. The HDI slides from 0.616 down to 0.613 before recovering back to the 0.617 mark by 2023.
Yeah, that dip is basically the statistical scar of the global macro events we all experienced earlier in the decade.
Ah, right, supply chains and all that.
Exactly. The supply chain collapses, the public health crises. Those events hit developing nations with fragile infrastructures disproportionately hard. But the fact that they recovered back to 0.617 demonstrates a real level of macroeconomic resilience.
Okay, so they survived the global shock, and they've improved their overall human development by 51% since 1990. On paper, that sounds like a massive, resounding victory. You would just assume a 51% improvement would rocket them up the global ranking.
You would think so, yeah.
But when we actually look at their placement, it feels like they are, I don't know, stuck on a treadmill.
The treadmill is actually an incredibly apt way to visualize the difference between absolute progress and relative advancement.
Yeah, think about how a treadmill works. You step onto the belt, you
Yeah.
start jogging, and over time you increase your speed by 51%. Your heart rate is up, your muscles are working way harder, you are objectively running much faster than when you started, but the belt beneath you is also speeding up. Because in 1990, an HDI of 0.409 put Laos at rank 124 out of 151 countries measured. But today, despite running 51% faster, their HDI of 0.617 places them at rank 155.
And that's exactly because the denominator changed. The global track has expanded from 151 runners to 203 runners. And the average speed of the whole pack has increased dramatically.
Yeah.
So absolute progress, meaning the undeniable fact that roads are better paved, clinics are more equipped, electricity is more reliable in Laos today than in 1990, that absolute progress does not guarantee a higher relative rank when the global baseline is just continuously shifting upwards.
Which means we really cannot just look at that composite score of 0.617 and move on, because the HDI isn't just some magical arbitrary number pulled from the ether, right?
No, not at all.
It's a composite index built on 3 specific pillars of human existence: longevity, knowledge, and wealth.
Yeah.
So if they're stuck on this treadmill, one of those pillars just must be structurally weaker than the rest.
Yeah, let's deconstruct those pillars against the world average so we can locate the exact friction points. We'll start with longevity, which is simply measured by life expectancy at birth. In Laos, life expectancy is just shy of 69 years, specifically 68.96. The world average is 73.38 years.
Okay, so we're looking at a gap of roughly 4.5 years, which is a meaningful difference in a human lifespan, obviously. It's certainly indicative of disparities in, like, advanced medical care and neonatal survival, but it's not a catastrophic chasm. It doesn't fully explain why they're lagging way back at rank 155.
You're completely right. The longevity pillar is actually relatively sturdy. The severe structural fractures, they really appear when we examine the next 2 pillars. Let's look at knowledge, which the UN measures using 2 metrics: expected years of schooling for children entering the system and mean years of schooling for adults currently in the population.
Okay.
So the expected years of schooling in Laos is 9.61 years compared to 13.04 globally.
So a child starting school today in Laos is expected to receive about 3.5 fewer years of education than the global average, which is concerning, sure. But the second metric, the mean years of schooling, that's the one that really just stops you in your tracks.
It does. The mean years of schooling for the current adult population in Laos is 6.06 years. The global average is nearly 9 years, 8.77 to be exact.
6 years. We really need to pause and think about what that actually means for a national economy. Because this isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. A mean schooling of 6.06 years means the average adult in the workforce essentially possesses a primary school education.
Yep, just the absolute basics.
And like if this were an entirely agrarian economy from the 18th century, basic literacy and numeracy might be totally sufficient. But we're talking about a nation trying to compete in the 2026 global market.
And in that market, a sixth grade education is a severe systemic bottleneck. I mean, it dictates the kind of industries a country can even attempt to develop.
You can't fake it.
No, you can't. You cannot build a robust technology sector. You can't develop advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing. And you can't optimize complex logistics networks when the bulk of your labor force lacks secondary education. You are just effectively locked out of the high-yield, knowledge-based economy.
Which leads directly into the third pillar, wealth. Because if your population is locked out of the knowledge economy, their earning potential is just artificially capped.
Exactly.
And the report measures this using gross national income, or GNI, per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, obviously, so we can compare apples to apples globally.
Right, and the wealth disparity here is severe. The GNI per capita in Laos is $8,106, while the global average sits at a pretty formidable $20,327.
So they're operating on roughly 40% of the global average income. But, and this is crucial here, is the critical flaw with looking at national averages. Averages are inherently deceptive. They smooth out all the rough edges of a society. Like if you have 10 people in a room and one person makes $1 million while the other 9 make literally nothing, the average income of that room is $100,000. The math looks great, but 9 people are starving.
Which is exactly why economists cannot rely solely on the standard HDI. To see the true texture of a society, we have to transition to the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
Right.
And this is where the diagnostic landscape becomes incredibly murky, but also incredibly revealing.
So how exactly does the IHDI work? For someone listening, how do you mathematically adjust human development for inequality?
Well, the IHDI basically functions like a stress test. It asks a fundamental question: what happens to a country's development score when you penalize it for how unequally that development is distributed among its citizens?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, it takes the total amount of health, education, and income in a country and looks at the distribution curve. If everyone has roughly the same amount, the HDI and the IHDI are identical. But as the gap between the rich and the poor, or the educated and the uneducated, widens, the IHDI score drops.
So it basically functions like an internal tax on the country's potential.
Mm.
And the results for Laos are honestly jarring, because we started with that baseline HDI of 0.617. But when you apply the inequality adjustment, the score just plummets to 0.462.
Yeah. It is a steep and highly, highly consequential drop.
I try to conceptualize this using a leaky bucket metaphor. Imagine human development as water, right? You pour 100 units of this developmental water into a bucket that represents the nation of Laos. But because the society is structurally unequal, because wealth and education are hoarded by specific demographics or geographic regions, the bucket has holes in it.
Big holes.
Huge holes. For Laos, 25.1% of their development simply leaks out onto the floor. It has entirely lost potential.
And to give you the comparative global context on that, the world average loss to inequality is 21.9%. So Laos is losing over a quarter of its developmental potential, running significantly higher than the global baseline.
Right. And if 25% of the nation's potential is just leaking out, we have to identify where the holes in the bucket actually are. What specific types of inequality are dragging the score down so much?
The report breaks down the total inequality penalty into 3 distinct categories. First, life expectancy inequality causes a 19.7% loss.
Okay.
Which basically means the gap between how long the wealthy live versus how long the impoverished live is significant, likely driven by, unequal access to urban healthcare centers. Second, income inequality accounts for a 23.6% loss.
Also huge.
But the largest fracture in the system, the absolute biggest hole in the bucket, is education inequality. That single factor creates a staggering 31.3% loss.
A 31.3% penalty purely on education. That means the divide between the highly educated elite and the lightly educated majority is the single heaviest weight dragging the whole nation down, without a doubt.
But, percentages can still feel abstract. To really understand what this educational fracture looks like for a family just trying to survive, the report pivots to another metric, the MPI, or Multidimensional Poverty Index.
The MPI is such a crucial evolution in how we measure human suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Because historically, poverty was defined purely by income. The classic living on less than $2 a day metric.
Right, which never tells the whole story.
Exactly. The MPI recognizes that poverty is not just a lack of cash. It is a complex web of simultaneous deprivations. It looks at whether a household lacks electricity, whether they have a dirt floor, whether they lack clean cooking fuel, and importantly, whether their children are attending school.
Right, and the 2023 MPI value for Laos is 0.082. But the raw value isn't what tells the story here. The two numbers we really need to focus on are the head count and the intensity.
Exactly. The headcount represents the sheer percentage of the population living in multidimensional poverty. And in Laos, that figure is 17.8%.
Nearly 1 in 5 people. Yes. But the intensity is where the true depth of the struggle is revealed. The intensity of poverty in Laos is 46.3%.
Let's break down what intensity actually means, because it is a vital concept for you to understand if you're listening. If the intensity is 46.3%, it means that of the 17.8% of people who are poor, they aren't just missing one basic necessity.
Right.
They are, on average, simultaneously deprived of nearly half of the 10 basic indicators of modern life. They don't just lack a toilet. They lack a toilet, their roof leaks, they have no electricity, and they cannot afford basic nutrition. It's this overlapping, compounded suffering.
And when the report isolates the specific drivers of this compounded suffering, we see your leaky bucket theory confirmed perfectly. Looking at the MPI contribution chart, education is the absolute anchor. The metric years of schooling accounts for 25.4% of the entire poverty burden.
Wow.
And the metric school attendance accounts for another 19.3%.
So if you combine those, nearly 45% of all multidimensional poverty in Laos is driven purely by educational shortfalls.
Which is a profound revelation for policymakers, because it means that traditional development interventions like, building a new highway or subsidizing agricultural exports, those will ultimately fail to eradicate poverty if 45% of the burden is locked inside the fact that citizens literally cannot read or write at a secondary level.
It completely reframes the problem. If education is the primary anchor holding the country back and causing this massive inequality tax, we have to ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
Who is being kept out of the classroom?
Exactly. The map tells us that education is unequal, but it doesn't tell us who's on the losing side of that equation. For that, we have to examine the gender divide. We have to look at the GDI.
The Gender Development Index. This is the point in the report where the narrative really just splits into two entirely different realities.
Yeah.
The GDI calculates the Human Development Index separately for men and women, which allows us to see if the rising tide is actually lifting all boats. In Laos, the male HDI is 0.640, but the female HDI is only 0.583.
So this calculates out to a GDI ratio of 0.911, placing Laos in Group 4 on the global scale, which is basically categorized as a medium-low equality grouping. But ratios and groupings can obscure the visceral reality.
They often do.
Right. And there's one specific data point in this section of the report that genuinely forced me to stop reading and recalibrate my entire understanding of this country. It is the secondary education chasm.
It is arguably the most critical bottleneck identified in the entire 15-page analysis.
The researchers looked at the population over the age of 25 adults who have, permanently aged out of the standard public school system. They measured how many of those adults had achieved at least some secondary education. Globally, for men, that number is 70.2%. For women globally, it is 62.0%.
Right, so there's an 8-point gap globally, which is problematic but somewhat clustered.
Right. Yeah, let's look at the numbers for Laos. For men in Laos, 31.0% have some secondary education.
A low number, sure, but reflective of the 6.06 mean years of schooling we discussed earlier.
But for women in Laos, the number is a staggering 19.3%.
Let that number sit for a moment, 19.3%.
That is a gap of more than 40 percentage points between a woman in Laos and the global average for women. Over 80% of the adult female population has never seen the inside of a high school classroom.
And this is where we move from a discussion about social justice to a discussion about hard macroeconomic viability. You literally cannot run successfully on the global economic treadmill when 80% of half your population lacks the basic foundational skills required for modern industry.
No.
It is equivalent to trying to run a marathon while intentionally paralyzing your left leg.
But here's where the data takes a highly counterintuitive turn. If I were to tell you, without any other context, that only 19.3% of women in a country have secondary education, your immediate assumption would be that these women are cloistered at home.
Of course.
You would just assume that low education naturally equals low workforce participation.
Because that is the standard historical economic assumption. In many developing nations, a lack of female education correlates directly with a complete absence from the formal, measured labor market.
But in Laos, the data shows the exact opposite. Lao women have a labor force participation rate of 61.5%.
Which is an extraordinarily high figure.
It's significantly higher than the global female average, which sits at just 48.5%.
Mm.
Women in Laos are working. They're actively participating in the physical output of the nation at a rate that beats the global average by 13 points.
Yet, because they lack that crucial secondary education, they are structurally barred from the formal, regulated economy. They can't get jobs in air-conditioned offices, they can't work in banking, they can't manage logistics.
Real.
Instead, they are funneled overwhelmingly into informal, vulnerable, or low-skill labor sectors. They are working in subsistence agriculture, unregulated textile manufacturing, or street-level commerce.
I think of this dynamic as the high-participation, low-reward bubble. Women in Laos are carrying a massive, disproportionate burden of the actual physical labor output of the country. But because of the educational bottleneck, they are entirely locked out of the income rewards.
Yeah.
And the data proves this disparity. Despite their 61.5% participation rate, the gross national income per capita for women is only $6,691. Compare that to Lao men, whose income is $9,507.
It is a nearly $3,000 gap in a country where the average income is only $8,000.
Think about what that actually means for household bargaining power. If you are a listener sitting in a dual-income home right now, imagine a scenario where one partner makes 30% less than the other, not because they work fewer hours, but purely because the state system barred them from attending high school.
It's devastating.
How did that structural income gap change who makes the financial decisions in the home? How does it impact autonomy?
It fundamentally strips the lower-earning partner of economic leverage. And on a macro scale, this dynamic artificially suppresses the national GNI, which drags down the wealth pillar of the HDI, which, you guessed it, keeps the entire nation stuck at rank 155.
So this leads us to the most vital question of the deep dive. We have established that these women are willing to work. They are participating at 61.5%. We have established that they are desperately penalized for not having a secondary education.
Right.
So what is the physical mechanism pulling them out of the classroom? If it isn't a lack of work ethic, what is structurally preventing them from getting past the 6th grade? To find the answer, we have to look away from the education data and look directly into the healthcare data.
We have to examine the Gender Inequality Index, or GII. The GII is distinct from the Gender Development Index we just talked about. While the GDI measures the gap in human development achievements, the GII measures the loss of achievement due to unequal treatment.
Important distinction.
Yeah. It examines 3 dimensions: empowerment, the labor market, and reproductive health. Laos has a GII value of 0.475, ranking it 123rd globally.
Let's briefly look at the empowerment dimension, just because it sets the stage. I look at this through the lens of a power funnel. You have women making up over half the active, sweating workforce. But as you move up the decision-making chain, the funnel women just vanish.
Look, they completely disappear.
Despite their massive labor contribution, women hold only 22.0% of parliamentary seats. The political power funnels away from them right at the top.
And the implication of a parliament that is 78% male is profound. It means that the national budgets, the systemic priorities, and the policies regarding public health infrastructure are predominantly being written by men.
Right.
And that context is absolutely vital when we pivot to the reproductive health data, because the reproductive data in this report sounds a blaring systemic warning siren.
The numbers are frankly severe.
Let's look at the maternal mortality ratio, the MMR. In Laos, there are 126 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. It indicates a health system that struggles to provide basic, safe delivery care. But the most critical data point in this entire analysis, the absolute linchpin that connects the poverty, the inequality, and the lack of education, is the adolescent birth rate, or ABR.
Which measures the number of births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19. Teenage pregnancy.
Correct. In Laos, the adolescent birth rate is an astonishing 81.65.
The visual dashboard in the presentation uses a speedometer graphic to drive this point home, and it is highly effective. If you picture a car's speedometer, the world average for adolescent birth rate is hovering down around 39.0. It's in the yellow zone.
Right.
But the needle for Laos is pinned all the way over into the deep red zone at 81.65. Their rate of teen pregnancy is more than double the global average.
And this is where the entire diagnostic puzzle pieces together perfectly. If we synthesize the data from the last 3 segments, the causality chain becomes undeniable. We asked earlier, why is the female secondary education rate so abysmally low at 19.3%?
Why are they vanishing from the classroom at age 13 or 14?
Because the adolescent birth rate is off the charts. High rates of unmanaged teen pregnancy act as a biological anchor. It physically forces girls to drop out of the education system right as they reach secondary school age.
They don't really have a choice.
Exactly. And once they drop out to raise a child, they are structurally trapped. They enter that high participation, low reward economic bubble you mentioned. They have to work to survive, but without the secondary education, they can only access informal, low wage labor.
And because they are trapped in low-wage labor, their families suffer overlapping deprivations, which drives up the overall intensity of the multidimensional poverty index we talked about.
Exactly. And that intense poverty creates the massive inequality tax that drags down the nation's entire inequality-adjusted human development index.
It is a complete closed-loop trap. Now, someone listening might argue, well, the obvious fix is to just build more secondary schools, put a high school in every village. But what the data proves is that building an empty classroom doesn't solve the problem if the girls are biologically and structurally prevented from sitting in the desks.
It proves that public health isn't merely a medical issue. It is the foundational bedrock of macroeconomics. You cannot fix the national GDP. You cannot improve the HDI without first fixing the adolescent birth rate. A lack of reproductive health care ripples outward to cripple the entire national economy.
Okay, we need to take a breath. Because the internal structural challenges facing Laos are immense. They're battling a 31% education inequality penalty, intense multidimensional poverty driven by a lack of schooling, and a biological bottleneck that traps women in low-yielding labor.
It's a lot.
It's a massive amount of friction. But how does any of this align with the paradox we introduced at the very beginning of this deep dive?
Ah, right. The environmental ranking.
Yes. How does a country with these deeply entrenched, severe internal struggles accidentally outperform the wealthiest nations on Earth when it comes to planetary pressure? How do they jump up 3 spots to rank 152nd when the environmental penalty is applied?
To understand this, we must examine the PHTI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index. This is a relatively new and honestly somewhat controversial evolution in how the UN measures global success.
Why is it controversial?
Well, for the entirety of the 20th century, the traditional HDI essentially rewarded countries for extracting resources, burning fossil fuels, and building massive industrial bases. If you cut down a forest to build a factory, your GDP went up and your HDI went up.
The planet paid the price, but the spreadsheet looked great.
Precisely. The PHDI attempts to correct this historical blind spot. It actually penalizes a country for the ecological damage it causes to achieve its human development. It looks at carbon dioxide emissions per capita and the material footprint per capita.
Meaning the total amount of raw biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals extracted to meet the country's consumption demands.
Exactly.
To explain how this math actually impacts a country's score, I want to introduce an environmental audit metaphor. Imagine every country in the world has to file an HDI tax return at the end of the year. But before the return is accepted, the globe's ecological auditors review the country's carbon and material footprint.
Okay, I like this.
If the footprint is high, the auditors levy a harsh planetary tax, directly reducing the country's final HDI score.
And under that system, the industrialized first world gets audited and fined heavily.
Exactly. The global average, the world taxpayer gets hit with a massive 10% penalty on their development score because of their heavy industrial footprint. But when the auditors look at Laos, their footprint is comparatively light. So Laos is only fined a 7.6% penalty.
And because their penalty at 7.6% is smaller than the global average penalty of 10.0%, their baseline HDI drops from 0.617 to a PHDI of 0.570, but their relative rank against the rest of the world naturally moves up 3 spaces.
They basically fall slower than everyone else.
Exactly.
Let's look at the exact footprint data from 2023 that results in this lower tax.
The differences are pretty clear. For carbon dioxide emissions, Laos generates 3.25 tons per capita. The world average is 4.54 tons. When we look at the material footprint, Laos extracts 10.02 tons of raw material per capita, whereas the world average is significantly higher at 12.71 tons.
Okay, I have to push back here. Is this an actual green miracle? Like, can we point to Laos and say, look at these brilliant sustainable policies that the West is ignoring? Or is this just the passive, accidental advantage of a country that simply hasn't built its polluting factories yet?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Right. Is this genuine environmentalism or just a lack of heavy industry masquerading as a green
Yeah.
policy?
And that is the most dangerous assumption a policymaker could make, confusing a lack of development with intentional sustainability, because the historical trend line in the data aggressively dismantles the green miracle myth.
How so?
Let's look back at the 1990 baseline. In 1990, Laos's per capita CO2 emissions were a minuscule 0.119 tons.
0.119. That is essentially a rounding error compared to modern industrial output.
It really is. But by 2023, as we just noted, it had reached 3.25 tons. If you do the math, that is an explosive, terrifying growth of nearly 27 times its original footprint in just over 3 decades.
A 27-fold increase.
Yes. The narrative that Laos is inherently green is a total statistical illusion. Their current advantage on the PHDI is entirely passive. It relies solely on their historical lack of heavy industry, and it is evaporating rapidly as their development scales up.
Wow.
If they continue on the traditional linear development path, the exact same path taken by Europe, North America, and East Asia during the 20th century, they will lose this planetary advantage entirely within a single generation.
So they're at a terrifying crossroads. They are staring down the barrel of a 27x carbon explosion while simultaneously realizing they must fix all those internal structural human development gaps.
Yeah.
They have to solve the 31% education inequality, they have to reverse the teenage pregnancy rates, and they have to pull millions of people out of multidimensional poverty. And they have to do all of this without stepping on the exact same carbon-heavy landmines that the developed world happily stomped on 100 years ago.
Which brings us to the ultimate strategic insights of the report. The data analysis expert group didn't just highlight the failures, they synthesized these 15 pages of complex data into 3 primary recommendations for Laos's future.
Okay.
They frame the strategy as moving from low-pressure growth, which we now know is just passive underdevelopment, to a high-quality leap.
Let's break down the blueprint. Pillar 1.
Pillar 1 is bridging the education chasm. The data conclusively proves that improving secondary education for women, which currently sits at that dismal 19.3%, is the ultimate domino in the system. If you intervene and fix this single metric, you automatically trigger positive cascading effects across the entire economy. You reduce the intensity of multidimensional poverty, you narrow the income inequality gap, and you transform the workforce from informal, low-yield labor into formal, high-yield human capital. It is the highest leverage point available.
But to push on that domino, you must implement Pillar 2, mitigating reproductive risk. As we discussed, you cannot fix the female education gap purely by constructing more brick-and-mortar schools.
No, you can't.
You have to implement targeted, aggressive public health interventions to address the massive adolescent birth rate of 81.65. You must ensure female representation in parliament so that these health initiatives actually receive funding. Until girls are no longer biologically forced out of the classroom by early pregnancy, they will remain the anchor holding back social progress. You have to fix the healthcare to fix the education to fix the economy.
It is an inextricably linked chain. And finally, Pillar 3, guarding the green baseline. This pillar introduces the crucial economic concept of leapfrogging. Laos cannot afford to follow the archaic model of pollute first, clean up later. That 20th century mindset is exactly what is driving their 27x CO2 explosion today.
What does leapfrogging actually look like in practice, though, for people who might not be familiar with the term?
Think about the telecommunications revolution in developing nations. Many countries in Africa and Southeast Asia never built massive, countrywide networks of copper telephone wires. Instead, they leapfrogged the landline era entirely and went straight to mobile cellular network.
Well, that makes total sense.
Right, it was cheaper, faster, and skipped a generation of obsolete infrastructure. Pillar 3 suggests Laos must do the exact same thing with its energy and industrial sectors.
So they can't afford to take out massive international loans to build a centralized, coal-powered energy grid, only to be forced to tear it down in 20 years when global carbon taxes make it unprofitable.
Precisely. Instead, Laos must use its current low industrial baseline as a feature, not a bug. Because they haven't sunk billions of dollars into legacy fossil fuel infrastructure, they are uniquely positioned to attract green technology investments.
Right.
They can build sustainable, low-carbon microgrids from scratch. They have the opportunity to leapfrog the dirty industrial phase entirely and land directly in the modern green economy.
So as we wrap up, let's return to the question I posed at the beginning. Why should you, the listener, care about the statistical intricacies of one nation in Southeast Asia, because Laos is a perfectly compressed microcosm of the defining friction point of the 21st century.
It really is.
The challenge they are facing is the exact same challenge facing the entire developing world. How do you pull millions of human beings out of grinding, intense poverty? How do you get them educated, healthy, and participating in a high-reward economy without pushing the planet's atmospheric capacity past the point of no return?
It is the existential balancing act of our time.
We started this journey looking at an illusion,
Mm.
the idea that a country was performing a green miracle. We dug through the leaky buckets of systemic inequality, we uncovered the hidden biological bottlenecks trapping women out of the classroom, and we dismantled the myth of passive sustainability. And we ended up with a stark realization of what it actually takes to engineer human development.
Yeah.
It isn't magic. It's about targeted health interventions. It's about giving a 14-year-old girl the structural support to stay in high school. And it's about having the vision to skip the coal age entirely.
And if I can leave you with a final lingering thought to explore on your own, we've spent this entire deep dive looking at how Laos is mathematically penalized for its internal inequality, yet rewarded globally for its light carbon footprint.
Right.
But think about the developed nations sitting comfortably at the very top of the standard HDI rankings, the nations we consider the pinnacle of human achievement.
The ones that run the global economy.
Yes. If a true aggressive planetary pressure penalty were fully integrated into how we measure global success, not just as a secondary alternative index, but as the only index we use to define a successful civilization, how many of our so-called first world superpowers would suddenly look like failing states?
That is a brilliant and unsettling question. If the global X-ray machine was truly calibrated to measure the health of the entire biosphere alongside human wealth, the diagnosis for the industrialized West might be grim. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the data behind the headlines, always look for the leaks in the bucket, and we will catch you next time.